2024 is officially over. So now it's time to rank every 2024 film that I saw from worst to best. Every year I manage to see around 50 films, and I'm actually kind of surprised that the number of movies I saw this year was around the same as usual, considering a lot of big releases that were supposed to come out this year got delayed due to strikes. So, let's get started. And in last place at number 55 is Night Swim. Now, January movies tend to get a bad reputation because they're generally not very good. Now, there are exceptions like Cloverfield, The Woman in Black, or Megan, but this is not one of them. This movie was awful. It's stupid and boring. Now, I've seen worse horror movies, but that still doesn't excuse how bad this movie is. Now, the first two-thirds are pretty effective with a creepy atmosphere and some good psychological horror, but the movie really falls apart and manages to disappoint in the last third. Now, the characters are all pretty generic, and the dialogue is clunky. There are some effective scenes, but overall, this is just a ripoff of Poltergeist. Or rather, Pooltergeist? It's a movie about a haunted swimming pool. Yeah, someone wrote this, pitched it, and someone else decided it was good enough to fund. It's a stupid idea with stupid execution that sinks to the bottom. Number 54, Madam Web. This is a very frustrating film, because it has a lot of style at times, but when it comes to the execution, it's an underdeveloped mess. Now, it is unique, feeling like a combination of the first Terminator film mixed with a bit of Final Destination. It has some cool ideas, but the ideas work better as ideas, rather than how it was actually written. The dialogue is cringy, the ADR is way off, the performances all around are pretty weak, and the film doesn't really give us any reason to care about the characters. It's a mess. Number 53, Lisa Frankenstein. Now, what's good about this film is the aesthetic. It looks like a more colorful Tim Burton film. It was sort of a mix between Warm Bodies and Edward Scissorhands. Most of the humor worked. There was a lot of macabre humor that set the film in its own world. Unfortunately, there is also a lot of vulgar sex-related humor that was lowbrow and brought the film down for me quite a bit. And like I said, the last half hour of this movie is a bit problematic. The film started out pretty cute, but then it goes in a very uncomfortable direction that's basically necrophilia, and also somewhat glorifies suicide. It's a shame, because up until the last 30 minutes, I was really enjoying most of this film, but because of those elements, I can't really recommend it for young teenagers, so I'd say just filter it with Clear Play or VidAngel. Now, that being said, I do think that Zelda Williams, who's the daughter of the late Robin Williams, is a good director, and I'm hoping she gets more work, and not just out of nepotism. She has some actual talent, so maybe her next movie will be a bit cleaner and a bit better. Number 52, If. Now, I know a lot of people really adored this film, and I'd be lying if I said I couldn't see why, but since one of the plot lines is about going through heart surgery and me being a survivor of 3 of those, this was a movie I found particularly triggering. And that's not a word that I use lightly. I thought this was just way too heavy of a family film. First off, the movie straight up opens with a montage of the main character's mom dying of cancer. Now, dead parent in a kid's film, okay, that's pretty typical, but as the film goes on, it gets more depressing, because John Krasinski's character is spending a few days in the hospital preparing for heart surgery. And like I said, I've gone through that 3 times and have had extended hospital stays, so yeah, I found the movie triggering. Because it's not just a minor plot point either, it becomes pretty key to the third act. What threw me over the edge of this movie was when the main character's grandma gets a call that, oh, we need to go to the hospital, something's wrong with your dad, and the little girl has to watch her dad almost die. So, yeah. If you've ever had to watch a loved one die in the hospital, it can be pretty triggering, and it was definitely triggering for me. I think John Krasinski hates kids, because this was definitely a movie that seems like it wants to make kids cry. Personal triggers aside, though, reviewing this sort of impartially, reviewing it like as how it was made, I still think it wasn't very well thought out. For one, the rules of the movie are very unclear, because for some reason only the kid can see the imaginary friends, even though she's trying to find new kids for them. And they never explain why she can see them and why nobody else can. Now, Ryan Reynolds can usually bring up a bad movie, but he's not given anything interesting or funny to say or do. At the end of the day, this is just a straight-up ripoff of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. I mean, the main imaginary friend is also named Blue, despite being purple. It's too heavy and boring for kids, and adults won't get anything out of it either. Number 51, Uglies. Now, I was expecting this movie to be pretty generic, but this surpassed my expectations for how bad it was. It feels like it was released 10 years too late, and it should have been released during the craze of the Hunger Games and Divergent. The film's biggest glaring issue is that they cast very conventionally attractive people to play these so-called uglies. That, in and of itself, immediately destroys the whole idea the movie is trying to convey. It's hard for us to feel sympathy for how the uglies are treated because, well, they're all pretty darn attractive. The villain is incredibly obvious, and the film offers nothing new that we haven't seen in other YA adaptations such as The Giver and Hunger Games. Perhaps the film could have something relevant to say in the days of Instagram filters and celebrities getting so much plastic surgery that they become unrecognizable, but any positive messages this film might have had are completely negated by the end. By the end, the film feels just like the pretties the film is speaking out against. Very, very bland and fake. Number 50, The Union. Halle Berry and Mark Wahlberg, as well as J.K. Simmons. With a cast like that, this seems like it would be fun. But unfortunately, this film is so dry and bland. It seems like there's a very specific audience for this film. Men in their 40s and older. And I'm not part of that audience, so it was hard to relate to this movie. And as far as the spy movie element goes, it's pretty forgettable and generic. Wahlberg and Berry don't have any chemistry and are not that entertaining to watch. Wahlberg's character is not that charming or likable. The humor in this movie feels very forced and awkward. J.K. Simmons gets a few chuckles every once in a while, but that's really it. This is just a bland, forgettable background noise movie, and it's not worth your time even if you are a fan of these actors. Number 49, Harold and the Purple Crayon. How did this get greenlit? Seriously. Take a 10-page book that has no conflict, age up the child main character so he's an adult, and give him an existential crisis. Because that's what all great kids movies need. And make the main character, who is a child in a book written for the 3 to 5-year-old crowd, a 40-something man-child. So stupid. How is this the same director as Ice Age and Rio? I'm not going to act like those movies were masterpieces or anything, but they were at least decent. There's so many problems with this movie. For one, when Harold enters the real world, which happens about 5 minutes into the film, so there's pretty much no build-up to this, he's a live-action human, but his friends the Moose and Porcupine are also live-action humans, which doesn't make sense. And the Porcupine character is in the movie so little that I kept forgetting she was a character. This feels like a movie that was written 20 years ago and is just now being made. It steals from movies like Elf and Enchanted, where the manic pixie dream boy or dream girl character enters an unfamiliar world, has an existential crisis, and wins the hearts of the skeptics and naysayers. Ironically, Zooey Deschanel is in this, and she doesn't play a manic pixie dream girl character like she usually does. It has all of the 2000s kids movie cliches, and the humor is just not funny. There's a joke where a bunch of old men call Zooey Deschanel's phone number and start flirting with her. The villain is unhealthily obsessed with Zooey Deschanel, and he ends up being rewarded for his creepy behavior. For a movie that keeps talking about the power and creativity of imagination, there's nothing creative or imaginative here. This is absolutely one of the worst kids' movies I have ever seen. There's nothing of value here. I've seen better scripts written by a 5-year-old in crayon. Number 48, Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie. I haven't really watched any new SpongeBob episodes in like 10 years, unless you count that Sponge on the Run movie from a few years ago so I could review it. I still like classic SpongeBob, but it seems that ever since the first movie, it's really gone downhill. One of my biggest complaints is, why is this entire movie CGI? What happened to good old-fashioned 2D animation? In the second movie, the CGI parts made sense, because they went from Bikini Bottom to the surface, so that was to differentiate it. But in the third movie and this one, it just seems odd. The CGI isn't even very good. It looks like graphics from a Nintendo GameCube game from the early 2000s. The plot is boring and uninteresting. The live action doesn't blend well at all with the CGI, unlike the first movie. The villain's motivations and plan are stupid, and I find it hypocritical that the film is portraying wanting to merchandise the SpongeBob characters as an evil plot, even though Nick has been doing the same thing for 25 years. In fact, this movie's very existence is an example of that. I can't remember any particularly funny jokes or moments or anything quotable. The Sandy Cheeks movie scrapes the bikini bottom of the barrel. Number 47, Borderlands. There's a line in this movie from Jack Black's character. I calculate our chances of survival at 0%? That never happens. That was my reaction to waking up the morning this came out, is seeing that at the time, this movie had a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, as I'm making this video, it's gone up, but only slightly. It's still drastically bad. And to be honest, I can see why. I never played the games, so my only exposure to this was the trailer, and I thought, This looks fun, I like the cast, I'll give this a shot. I like cheesy video game movies like Street Fighter or the 1995 Mortal Kombat, and what I got was not a complete disaster, but I wouldn't say the film was competently made either. What it does well is the aesthetic of the planet, and the action is pretty well done too. Unfortunately, the film was marred by paper-thin characters, jokes that fall flat, and a plot that just isn't that interesting. How thin are these characters? If you thought the line from Suicide Squad, "This is Katana, she's got my back," was the worst way to explain a character, this looks well thought out by comparison to those. Literally, the only 2 out of 5 characters of any sort of development or arc are Kate Blanchett and Ariana Greenblatt. The rest of the characters are just there. And even then, Greenblatt, you can tell she's having fun in this movie, has a very paper-thin character. She's essentially the story's MacGuffin, but they also try really hard to give her a tragic backstory, while also making her part of the team, and I don't know, I don't think it worked. But the huge, huge shame about this movie is this is a great cast. Kate Blanchett, Jack Black, and Kevin Hart are all great in other things, just not here. I haven't seen a Jack Black performance this unfunny since Shark Tale. Not a single line that came out of this character, who was supposed to be comic relief, was even remotely funny. And considering that this was being marketed as being similar to Suicide Squad or Guardians of the Galaxy, which are movies about a bunch of misfits that hate each other, that come to love each other in the end, meanwhile spewing witty banter, there's no witty banter. The villain is also very paper-thin and just lousy. What a disaster this movie is. Based on feedback from people who played the game, they seem to really hate it, and I, who never played the game, didn't find it all that entertaining either. It's just a poor man's Suicide Squad. Number 46, Piece by Piece. I have absolutely no idea who this movie was for. There was no reason for this to have been Lego. It just feels like Pharrell Williams wanted it to be Lego so it would stand out for other biopics, but they didn't really do anything to take advantage of that medium. Unlike other Lego movies, there's no humor, there's no self-awareness, there's no satire. If you're going to do it in Lego form, make it sort of satire in biopics like the Weird Al movie or Surf's Up. But no, you replace the Lego with live action, it's the same movie. I feel like it was only made in Lego because they thought it might make people give them a shot at getting nominated for a Best Animated Film Oscar. Who is the audience for this? Kids will find it very boring, and I don't think many adults are clamoring to watch a Lego movie about Pharrell Williams. On top of that, the movie is PG, but despite that technically kid-friendly rating, you can tell it really, really wants to be PG-13. Ironically, by using the Lego format to express himself, Pharrell actually limits himself because of how much they'll let him do in the Lego setting. Really, this just feels like 2 hours of Pharrell and his friends in the music industry getting together and saying, "Look how famous we are! Look how awesome it is to be a celebrity!" The big problem with this is Pharrell produced the movie himself, so of course he's not going to include anything that makes him look bad. What makes biopics interesting is it shows the subject's good and bad sides. This is just 100% of Pharrell essentially patting himself on the back. Ironically, the movie that actually is called the Lego Movie feels like less of a commercial than this does. This whole film just feels so self-indulgent. There's a line in this movie that Pharrell says where relevance is a drug, which seems so hypocritical, since it seems the only reason for this movie's existence is for Pharrell to stay relevant. This also feels like the studio reminding us, hey, we made Despicable Me. Remember how much you loved the song Happy 10 years ago? Remember? We did that. Praise us. We made Despicable Me. We made the Happy song. What makes biopics interesting is the struggles of the subject of the biopic, and this doesn't have any of that. Pharrell was just a guy who was in the right place at the right time, who knew the right people. There's no juice, there's no meat, there's no conflict. If you're in that very, very small niche who's into both Lego and Pharrell Williams, wait to stream it. And if this idea doesn't appeal to you, you're not missing out, and it's not going to surprise you, and you can skip it. Number 45, the Garfield movie. I really wanted to like this one. It's the same director as Emperor's New Groove and has Chris Pratt, so I was really hoping this would at least be passable. Unfortunately, that same director also did Chicken Little, which is, unfortunately, what this film is more in the camp of. The only praise I can give this film is the animation. The animation is expressive and takes advantage of cartoonish, exaggerated movements and facial expressions. Plot-wise and joke-wise, though, there's nothing here. This doesn't even really have anything to do with Garfield. It feels like a run-of-the-mill talking animal movie that would have come out in the early 2000s if they slapped the Garfield name on. There are barely any Garfieldisms in this film. Garfield is not cynical or sarcastic. There aren't many jokes about his weight, and all of the amusing things Garfield does are essentially thrown aside. As much as I like Chris Pratt, and as great as he was in the Lego Movie and Mario, he doesn't try here. It doesn't sound like Garfield, it just sounds like him. The film doesn't even feel like it takes influence from the comic or cartoon. I saw this with family, and the youngest kid in the group was around 10 years old, so she'd be the target demo for this, but she didn't like it either. Garfield may be fat, but the plot of the movie sure is thin. If you want amusing cat antics, you're better off spending 2 hours watching cat videos on YouTube. Descendants Rise of Red. The continuity errors in this are just baffling to me. It tries to connect itself to the 1997 Cinderella musical by bringing back the actors to play Cinderella and Charming, but that doesn't explain how a black woman and a Filipino man were able to have a white child, meaning Chad Charming from the first 3 films. The stepmother is also played by a different actress, which further calls into question the continuity. And also, we're supposed to believe that Cinderella and Charming met in high school, even though in the original movie that these actors are from, they don't meet until the ball, just like in the original story. And Ursula has a sister in this, but her name is not Morgana like it was in Little Mermaid 2. And if you're going to connect all the Disney movies, at least keep the continuity consistent. And this doesn't feel like it's doing that at all. I will say it is the best looking of the 4 movies. You can tell they gave this one the highest budget, because it doesn't have that TV movie look. It looks like there was money put into this, but that's really the only good thing I have to say about it. The plot is basically just Alice through the Looking Glass, where they use time travel to try and stop the Queen of Hearts from turning evil. And even though Uma comes back for a brief scene or two, they don't mention Harry Hook, which is odd, because he was super in love with her and loyal to her, and now he's just gone. And the object they use for time travel is a pocket watch. And in the show Miraculous Ladybug, there's a rabbit superhero that also has time travel powers, so he uses a pocket watch. And that's very clearly influenced from Alice in Wonderland. But here, it feels like they stole it from Miraculous. And at the end of this movie frustrates me, because they do succeed in their mission. They make sure Queen of Hearts doesn't turn evil. But then they go back to the moment she attacked and set the plot into motion, and she's clearly not evil anymore, so why were the inhabitants of Wonderland not allowed to travel to Oridon? They explained they walled off Wonderland because Queen of Hearts is so crazy and dangerous, but since she's not crazy and dangerous anymore, why was Wonderland walled off? And why is Hades, the literal god of Greek hell, allowed on the island and not banished? Is Queen of Hearts really the most evil villain? There's so many plotlines and continuity errors with this one. It feels cheap and lazy, just a cash grab. You can stick with the first 3 movies and skip this one. Number 43, Fly Me to the Moon. This is one of the most confusing movies I've seen this year. Meaning, I was confused by the tone and what it was trying to go for. I liked the 1960s aesthetic, and the film is very pretty to look at. The film also has an all-star cast, but unfortunately, that cast is wasted by a lousy script. I'm not really sure what this film was trying to be. Satire? Drama? It was really confusing. It's not a true story, but it's also not really a satire, and it focuses an awful lot on marketing gimmicks, so I have no idea who the audience for this is supposed to be. If this was a true story about people working behind the scenes at NASA, or if the film leaned more into the ridiculous idea that the moon landing may have been faked, maybe it could have worked. I don't know. I just didn't get the movie. Perhaps Apple should get out of the movie business and stick to making overpriced electronics. Though, ironically, the other movie that Apple put out this year, way higher on this list, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Number 42, Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. If you forgot this movie came out, I don't blame you. There's been very little marketing for it, and honestly, I think that's because the studio knew this movie isn't very good, but they didn't want it to be a victim of another tax write-off. This is Lord of the Rings in name only. This feels more like someone's generic fantasy anime that they put the Lord of the Rings name on because of brand recognition. The story is pretty forgettable, with characters that are just as bland and forgettable. Our main character is a princess who, get this, doesn't want to get married and instead wants to fight in battle, but oh no, her father won't let her. Gee, haven't seen that before. And it's not just her. All the characters in this movie are very underdeveloped. There's a scene about halfway through where a character is killed in battle, and it's played like it's this big deal, this big emotional moment. But when they died, I felt nothing, because we'd only spent like 30 seconds with them prior to this. The characters all feel like tropes, not characters. The villain's plan is unclear. The battle scenes aren't even that compelling because I don't care about the characters, and therefore I don't care about the stakes. The dialogue is also pretty cliche. I'm not afraid of you. You should be. You will be. The one positive, it is well animated, especially the backgrounds. My word, the backgrounds in this movie are gorgeous. I couldn't tell at times if they were drawn or photos. That's how realistic and detailed they look. Now maybe if this were a 10-episode series instead of a 2-hour movie, it would have been more compelling. But this is a movie that, even if you're a Lord of the Rings or anime fan, that you can skip. Number 41, Red One. This movie has an identity crisis. It does not know what it wants to be. It's trying to be a safe action film while also tying itself to Christmas, and unfortunately it just keeps harkening back to much better Christmas movies. The way it ties in other mythical figures such as the Headless Horseman and the Krampus feels a bit more reminiscent of Dreamworks Rise and the Guardians. The elves who provide Santa with tech, such as Q from James Bond, has already been done on Prep and Landing and the Santa Claus. The film's plot template is just the first Men in Black, with a light Christmas template over it. Dwayne Johnson is the equivalent to Tommy Lee Jones, the seasoned veteran who wants to retire from the business of hunting supernatural creatures, and Chris Evans is the new recruit who's brought in for his special skills, and they need to find an object that is going to take over, and yeah, you've seen this before. It's just your standard generic buddy action comedy, except unlike Men in Black, where Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith would crawl off each other, you don't feel that with Chris Evans and The Rock. None of the jokes work, and the ones that bomb the hardest are of course the ones that go on for way too long. It does have some interesting lore and world building, but this is a Christmas film that you can skip and it ends up on the naughty list. Number 40, Despicable Me 4. I'm someone who defends the Minions films and found them somewhat charming, so when I say that I didn't like this one, you know it wasn't good. The main issue is it has the Iron Man 2 or Secret Life of Pets 2 problem, where it feels like they had too many ideas they wanted to do, and they couldn't decide on one or two of them, so they decided to use all of them. There's a plot about the main villain who is very underdeveloped. There's a plot about turning the Minions into superheroes, which they already kind of did that with the mutated Minions plot in Despicable Me 2. There's a plot about a hairstylist wanting to get revenge over his wife. There's a plotline about Gru being forced to train this little girl to be a villain. And it jumps between these plotlines so quickly that it feels like episodes of a TV show they edited it as a movie. And the humor in this movie is either more of the same or feels derivative of other movies. Gru has a baby now, and the antics and mischief this baby gets into feel ripped straight from Jack Jack from the Incredibles movies. There's a dated joke about the Honey Badger Don't Care meme. This movie feels like it's trying too hard to appeal to the kids. And the villain's motivations in this movie are so face-palmingly stupid. I thought, really? That's his backstory and motivation? The other villains in the series were kind of interesting, but this villain is not interesting at all. And he's also only in the movie for like the first 10 minutes, and it doesn't even really play that big role until the last 20 minutes or so. So he's pretty underdeveloped anyway. Number 39, Afraid. I find it ironic that this is a movie about evil technology, and it's distributed by Sony. There are some good elements to this movie. John Cho is great as one of the main characters. The voice of the evil AI does a good job of switching from friendly to creepy to evil, but as far as the writing goes, it's pretty generic. It doesn't present any new ideas about AI, and it feels like at times they're taking inspiration from movies like Megan, Age of Ultron, and that Disney Channel movie Smart House and the show Black Mirror. Everything in this movie has already been done before, and done much better. It does present both sides of the argument, though. It shows advantages and ways AI can be used for good, but it also very heavily leans into the AI is bad message. The first two acts are decent, but the third act is where it starts to fall apart. And there's a plotline about a cult that worships this AI that comes out of nowhere, and even some of the ideas with that, where the AI made people disappear, aren't resolved. And despite some of the horrible things this AI does, the end tries to make the audience sympathetic to the evil AI, and it just doesn't work. If you saw the trailer and you thought it looked interesting, rent it on discount, otherwise, skip it. Number 38, The Fire Inside. Now, I'm not really a sports movie guy. I like my sports movies to be kind of hokey and silly. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Gymkhana. The only sports dramas I've seen that I liked are the first two Rocky movies, the first two Creed movies, and Eddie the Eagle. Other than that, I'm pretty mad on them, and I don't naturally gravitate towards them. And as far as sports movies go, yeah, it's pretty average. The main issue is there's not really a lot of character development. The main character pretty much stays the same throughout the movie. The pacing is also a bit wonky. You think the movie's going to end around the hour and a half mark, but nope, there's still another 30 or 45 minutes left, and it's honestly not that interesting. Now, the one standout performance here is Brian Tyree Henry. He plays the coach really well, and he can be both dramatic and funny. This movie was clearly made as Oscar bait, and honestly, I think he deserves the Best Supporting Actor nomination for this movie. This movie was made by Amazon, so it was clearly meant to go to streaming, but they released it in theaters in order to be eligible for Oscars consideration. If you like sports movies and you don't care that this one is basically a less interesting version of Rocky, wait to stream it. Number 37, Twisters. I have no nostalgia for the original Twister. The first time I watched it was a few days before seeing this, and I thought the first Twister was just okay. Nothing special. And that's how I feel about this one. I do think it is slightly better than the original because it's more intense, and I think the characters in this one are better, but this wasn't a movie I loved. It does feel like it's trying a bit too hard to appeal to a new generation by having a younger cast, and by having one of the main characters being influencer obsessed with online clout. This is pretty beat for beat the original, feeling more like a remake rather than a true sequel. This wasn't really my type of movie. I like my disaster movies to be schlocky, and these movies are just a bit too serious. But if you like the original, you'll probably like this one. But if not, this one isn't going to do much for you either. Number 36, Venom: The Last Dance. After some borrowed trust on these Venom movies, Sony managed to pull the rug out from underneath me and greatly disappoint me with this third one. The trailers got me so hyped for this movie. It promised a big epic showdown, a true finale, going out with a bang, and 90% of the cool stuff was in the trailer. Now, it is more of the same of what we like about the first two Venom movies, the relationship between Eddie and Venom and some funny one-liners from Venom, but on a plot level, the movie's really flimsy. All the Venom movies have their silly moments, but this one got too silly, to the point where I was just burying myself in face-palming embarrassment when I was witnessing on screen. A huge, huge problem I had with this movie is the same problem I had with Let There Be Carnage. The second act is just nothing but filler. You can leave the theater for the entire middle section of this movie and come back for the last half hour and still feel like you missed nothing. That being said, the last act is pretty cool. It's not enough to make up for how lackluster the rest of the movie is. If you're maybe 10 years old, then you might have fun with this, but this movie just felt lacking. If you're one of those people who absolutely has to watch every Marvel project, just wait for Netflix. And if you're in the camp who were indifferent on or didn't like the first Venom movie, this one's not going to win you over either, and you can justify skipping it. That being said, it's at least more competently made more than, say, Morbius or Madam Web. Number 35, Mean Girls. The original Mean Girls is one of those movies that was lightning in a bottle. It had just the right cast and the right script, and it became one of the most iconic movies of the 2000s. On one hand, I can see why they tried to do it again. The original was 20 years old, high school has changed a bit, teens now have social media, something that wasn't really a thing in 2004, at least not to the level it is today. I do appreciate they did semi-update the story to relay the same message to a new group, but other than modern technology and making it a musical, this movie doesn't really do anything new. It's beat for beat, almost line for line the same story, and the jokes are either ones that are being repeated from the original, or they're removed entirely. And Jerry Rice, I'm probably mispronouncing that, is much more believable in the lead role, and she brings a kind of innocence and naivete to it. Renee Rapp also does a great job as Regina George, and yes, thankfully this is a musical where the performers can actually sing. Nothing sounds auto-tuned or off-key. Unfortunately, this is also a musical where the songs aren't that memorable. And plot-wise, you've literally seen this all before. It's like a lot of the Disney live-action remakes where very few of them do anything to justify it being made, and instead just rely on the nostalgia for the original. If you're a fan of the musical and you want to watch it on a big screen, it might be fun for you, but if I have a choice between which two versions of the movie I'm going to watch, I'm going to choose the original. While it has good performances, this version is just not that fetch. Number 34, Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. It's a pilot episode for a TV show. I don't have that much to say about it. I didn't think it was as bad as everyone else seemed to. I thought the new villains could be pretty fun, but it is nowhere near as smart as the original, and it focuses too hard on trying to be trendy with the TikTok generation. It was amusing, but not a film I'm going to revisit. Number 33, Unfrosted. This movie is clearly parody, and it's not meant to be taken seriously. If you go into it knowing that, you can have a fun time with it. It can be pretty smart when it wants to be, and there's a lot of fun celebrity cameos. I thought the movie was pretty interesting, even if it's not 100% true. This feels like serial mascot Avengers. It has a lot of fun with it. Jokes about the 1960s time period are pretty funny. It's not great, but it's passable. Number 32, Kung Fu Panda 4. DreamWorks is pretty hit or miss. They did Orion in the Dark about a month before this came out, and we'll get to that when we get to that. And then right before this, they did Megamind to the Doom Syndicate, which I already talked about. And then after Kung Fu Panda 4, they did Wild Robot, which, again, we'll get to when we get to. Kung Fu Panda 4 is just kind of okay. Now, I think the first three Kung Fu Panda films are all pretty solid, and I think the sequels improved everything that was great about the first film. The third film wrapped things up rather nicely. And then we have this fourth one, which doesn't really do anything new and feels unnecessary. The Furious Five, who were major characters in the other films, aren't even in this, and Poe doesn't really feel like he goes through any major character growth. The first film was about him becoming the Dragon Warrior, the second film was about him finding inner peace, and the third film was about him passing on his teachings to the next generation. This one just kind of goes through the motions. There isn't really anything about this film that expands the world or characters, and a lot of the film is really just nostalgia baiting, and using it as an excuse to bring back old villains. The story was pretty weak. There's a subplot about Poe's adopted dad and biological dad that pads the runtime. Awkwafina, as always, is annoying. There's some good martial arts action, but it's not really a story it felt like it needed to be told. Number 31, My Spy, The Eternal City. Now, the first My Spy I thought was just okay. It was pretty much the game plan, the pacifier, all these movies where the tough guy has to take care of a child and has his heart changed in the process. It was enjoyable, but safe. This one was a bit better. Dave Bautista is now the kid's guardian of the galaxy. Come on, I had to make that joke. Now, the first half of the movie was very familiar because it is so similar to Spider-Man Far From Home. School trip to Italy, villain attacks, there's world-ending stakes, the main kid has a plan to ask them to crush out Italy just like Peter does. It's almost beat for beat Spider-Man Far From Home. And then the second half sort of becomes similar to Taken. Plot-wise, it's very familiar, doesn't really do anything new with the spy genre, but it is still very fun. It's silly, but it's silly in a fun way, not in a way that's face-palmingly incompetent. And the main villain is really good. I'm not going to spoil who plays the villain because revealing that actress would be a huge spoiler, but I have seen them in other things, and I've never seen them play a villain before. I was pleasantly surprised by how they pulled it off. It's a very typical spy movie stakes, you've seen a dozen other spy movies, but if that's the kind of stuff you like, you'll most likely have fun with it. I certainly did. Number 30, Atlas. I don't know what movie other people watched, but I thought the film was decent. Not great, but decent. This is the same director as San Andreas and Rampage, and both of those are turn-off-your-brain action flicks, and this is the same. Granted, the film isn't really anything you haven't seen before. It even quotes iRobot, and knows exactly what it's doing when presenting its ideas about AI. I enjoyed the dynamic between Atlas and Smith. I thought Smith provided some good comic relief to the film, and the action in this film is pretty decently choreographed. If you're looking for a fun turn-off-your-brain popcorn flick, if you're a fan of, say, Alita Battle Angel, that's what you're going to get. If you're expecting something more thought-provoking like The Creator, that's where you'll be disappointed. Number 29, Damsel. I didn't know what to expect going into this at first. I thought it was going to be this typical fantasy movie where the main girl character being reluctantly married off to a prince she doesn't like. I thought it was going to be the same old tired tropes like I've seen in this type of story before, because that's kind of how it starts out. But after the first half, the film goes in a completely different direction, and I'd be going, oh, that's what we're doing with this. And the film more or less changes genres by becoming a survival horror set in a fantasy world. It's actually pretty intense at points. Predator and or Brave should have been like this. Brave is basically just Mulan set in Scotland with a little bit of Brother Bear thrown in. This is strong female lead holding her own against an intense threat, and using her wits and knowledge to escape. That's kind of what Brave was trying to be but failed. And the villains are fantastic. I love the relationship between the main character and her family. The story is intense, it's well directed, and I had a great time with it. My issue, like I said, is the first half is a bit tired and predictable. I feel the first half could have been a bit stronger, just kind of sticking with the familiar. But if you want what is essentially a fantasy version of Predator, this is an intense fantasy thriller worth watching. Number 28, Carry On. The plot of this is basically the first two Die Hard movies, where a group of terrorists take over Christmas at an airport, and the main character's security guard has to play the main villain's game of cat and mouse and stop a bomb from going off in a plane. There's even a character who's the wise black friend trope. So plot-wise, it's not that original, but it is well directed in terms of the action. If you liked what the director did with Non-Stop, there's more of that here. The film also has a bit of comedy to it as well. Jason Bateman is fantastic as the villain. He plays Evil Genius really well. I know I compared this to Die Hard, and even though there is some action, it's less of an action movie and more of a cat-and-mouse battle of wits game. It's incredibly exciting, and this does of course raise the question, is it really a Christmas movie, or just an action thriller that takes place at Christmas? That's for you to decide. If you want a fun, if not somewhat familiar new Christmas movie, book the flight. And speaking of movies about planes, number 27, Lift. Ocean's 11 and Mission Impossible were thrown into a blender to give us Lift, a Netflix movie with fun, over-the-top action and a clever plot. I thought this movie was pretty enjoyable and fun. It has a good cast, It has a clever premise about trying to pull off a heist on a plane, and it's got some exciting moments of quick pacing. However, as far as heist movies go, it's pretty safe. There aren't really any unpredictable twists. It's pretty formulaic, but it's still enjoyable. The film doesn't really get going until the second act when the characters start planning the heist. And before that, there's way too much talk about NFTs that will date this movie, and they come off as cringy and try to be trendy. I thought the action was fun to watch, and the story, while predictable, did still have its moments, and I'm glad I watched it. Number 26, Imaginary. Who would have thought that you could make imaginary friends scary? This is a very well done spooky horror film. It's got a lot of really good build-up, suspense and mystery, and there's some twists in the second and third act that I thought were really well done about what this imaginary friend really is, what it wants, and the rules for the story were all very well done. It also kind of reminded me of a show that was on ABC about 10 years ago called The Whispers, which was very similar. That show was about kids who were being controlled by what the parents thought were imaginary friends, but there was actually something more sinister going on with it. It kind of reminded me of that. Had a very similar plot to that. And this is one of the rare horror movies where the plot does make a bit more sense than it should, given the premise. And thankfully, the second and third act twists do not ruin the film. I actually think the second and third acts are pretty fantastic. And I gotta praise the practical effects in this. The teddy bear and some other elements to it that are not going to spoil, those practical effects are all very well done. Whether that was done through puppets or animatronics, and if there was CGI in this film, it was well done CGI. And the psychological horror is also great. Now, I wish they kept the mystery of the imaginary friend a little bit longer. They set it up a bit too soon, and I wish they kind of strung the audience along a little bit longer than they did, because it does lose a little bit of the mystery a bit more quickly than it should have. But that's a nitpick. Now, you're definitely going to like this movie. This is one of your first horror movies. It's definitely a gateway entry-level horror film. If you're a horror aficionado, it's probably not going to do that much that's different for you. But if you have a young kid, this is kind of one of the first things they want to do. It's kind of a good gateway entry movie. I did find some similar movies to this that might, a little bit of Coraline or a little bit of Chucky or kind of Megan that came out last year. So this is a gateway horror film. It's probably going to enjoy this a lot. If not, I don't know what you're going to think of it. I thought it was Blumhouse's better films, though, as far as PG-13 horror films go, and this is one of their better ones. Number 25, Transformers 1. The trailers did a terrible job of selling what this movie actually is. The trailers make it seem like the Cinephile movie for the 6 to 9-year-old crowd, and while there is some of that here in terms of the humor, this movie was actually a very mature, thought-provoking story about the proletariat rebelling against the bourgeoisie. I'm not kidding, and I kind of wish I was. There's not a lot of Transformers type action. It's more of a story of class struggle and oppression, which is weird. But it also kind of works. The story is serious and deals with its mature themes, which is why the humor brings it down. It feels like the movie was made for two different audiences. The adults who grew up with the original Generation 1 Transformers, and their kids. It's a very weird mixture of tones that doesn't always mesh well. It's like the first couple of seasons of Clone Wars, where it was this very serious war drama, and then you had the cheesy one-liners from the battle droids. The story is also very reminiscent of X-Men First Class and Ants. The animation is stunning. It looks like toys come to life and is immersive. The film also has some quick references and Easter eggs related to Transformers that fans will appreciate. While not all of it lands, and it's hard to tell exactly who the target audience for this is, since kids don't really pick up on the complex themes of the film, it's definitely better than the trailers, and it's more than meets the eye. Number 24, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Controversial opinion, but you know this already if you watched my review of Part 1 of Rebel Moon. I enjoyed it. I was one of the few people who was actually excited for Rebel Moon Part 2. And Part 2 is a massive improvement over the already, in my opinion, great Part 1. And honestly, this is Netflix. Audiences are used to watching something for several hours. I mean, it took me like 3 days to get through the last season of Stranger Things, because it was like 10 hours long. So I think this probably just should have been a 4-hour movie. They should have done it as Part 1, Part 2. They should have just edited together as a 4-hour long movie, because this is Netflix. In my mind, this is a Star Wars movie directed with style. I think if they put Part 1 and 2 together, splitting up in a weird way, it probably would have gotten better reception, because Part 1 was pretty much just character intros. We're going to go to this planet to recruit this character. We're going to go to this planet to recruit this character. We're going to go to this planet to recruit this character. Thankfully, the characters were interesting, so I enjoyed seeing that. But now that the team is together, and that's where we left off in Part 1, the story can actually kick into high gear. And I think that the lore that Zack Snyder is building for the Rebel Moon universe is very compelling. And though there are some similarities to Star Wars, which are very obvious, there's also enough here that's unique, and it hasn't really been done in the sci-fi epic before. There's not much I can say about Part 2 that hasn't already been said about Part 1. Again, it's essentially a grittier Star Wars, which is the same style as like Rogue One and the Andor series. So if you like that tone, if you like gritty Star Wars, you want to see what Zack Snyder would have brought to that, this is worth checking out. Number 23, Beetlejuice. It was definitely worth not only the 5-year wait since Tim Burton's last film, but also the 30-year wait since the original Beetlejuice. I wouldn't necessarily call this a legacy sequel, though it does have members of the original cast while also focusing on the next generation, because legacy sequels tend to be essentially the first movie again. This, for the most part, is not. It does what all great sequels do, which is expand upon the ideas of the original. You get to spend more time in the afterlife, and Burton really brings his trademark macabre humor and touch to the film. He's also a big user of practical effects, which is refreshing. It feels like no time has passed for Michael Keaton, as he very naturally returns to the role of Beetlejuice. Jenna Ortega's character is interesting in the sense that she's the daughter of Winona Ryder's character from the first film, but unlike Winona Ryder's character, she's not super interested in the paranormal or supernatural. And instead of using Beetlejuice to get rid of a threat in the living world, he's instead used to get rid of a threat in the underworld. There are some good twists in the first and second act. The whole cast is great, and it's a nice, sweet, family-centric story, but what holds it back is it does kind of fall apart in the third act. The third act climax is essentially the same as the first film, and there are also a few too many characters and plot lines. There's a plotline about Beetlejuice's dead fiancé out for revenge, and they don't really do anything with that until almost the end. And there's a plotline about one of the villains trying to use Jenna Ortega's character to escape from the world of the living. They don't really feel so much like characters as they did plot devices to get the main characters to where the story needed them to be the plot along. It's not as fresh as the original, but it still comes pretty close. It's worth seeing 3 times. Number 22, The Watchers. This movie was directed by the daughter of M. Night Shyamalan, and you can tell that it's influenced by some of his films, specifically The Village. This one reminded me a lot of The Village. This had a really interesting story with a nice creepy atmosphere. However, it does feel more like dark fantasy than straight-up horror, but I enjoyed the film did the genre. It is a bit reminiscent of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Overall, I thought this was a very well-done horror movie, even if it feels a bit derivative of other films. Number 21, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. Now, this isn't going to be for everybody. If you enjoyed Ghostbusters Afterlife, it's more of that. But if you saw the movie and you thought, Kid Ghostbusters, not for me, this one isn't going to win you over. As for me, I really enjoyed Ghostbusters Afterlife, but I did have the issue of the plot essentially being Star Wars The Force Awakens, where it's basically the first movie again, but there's a younger cast, as well as appearances from the old original cast. This one is an improvement over Ghostbusters Afterlife. It takes everything that worked about that film and keeps it in this one, but the plot this time is not just a straight-up redo of the original film. Paul Rudd, who was more of a supporting character in the original, gets a bigger role in this. This feels like a Ghostbusters version of The Incredibles, where it's a family of Ghostbusters. There's also some fun little references to the real-life pop culture influence of the original film. If you were a kid in the 80s and you remember there being Ghostbusters products for everything, there's a few references to those. There's a nice little entry-level spooky movie along the lines of the Goosebumps episodes. This is a Ghostbusters for kids who are probably a bit too young for the original, because, let's be honest, the original has some dialogue and moments that are a bit iffy. This one cleans it up a bit. Also, this is the same director as Monster House, which is also a nice little entry-level scary movie. It's very representative of that. Now, my one criticism is there are a few too many plot lines going on in this movie, and the plot doesn't flow as well as it could have. But overall, I thought it was very fun, and I hope they continue on with these movies. Like I said, if you're not a fan of the idea of kid Ghostbusters, this movie's not going to win you back. But if you did enjoy Ghostbusters Afterlife, you'll probably enjoy this one. Number 20, I Saw the TV Glow. This is one of the best, most original, and also weirdest horror movies I've ever seen. It's a great psychological horror. If you want a movie that will mess with your mind in the best way, this is one to check out. It doesn't really get going with the horror until about halfway through, but even then, the build-up has some interesting characters. You forget the scares haven't come yet. When it finally does get going, it's got some of the most mind-warping visuals I've seen in a horror film. Even in the real world, as opposed to show the film focuses on, something feels off about the whole thing, which is effective, since the character is also questioning his own reality. This felt like a film version of a creepypasta, specifically Candle Cove, which had a slightly similar premise, but the film stands out from Candle Cove with the way it portrays its characters. The characters are what make this movie. The filmmakers did a great job of making the film feel like the 90s. Everything from the opening credits of Pink Opaque, the show the characters are obsessed with, to the visual style, effects, and acting feel very 90s, similar to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They did a great job of making everything about the show feel just a teeny bit off, A feeling that something is wrong, but you don't know exactly what, will linger with you with this movie. This is a film that will keep you intrigued from beginning to end, and by the end will have you questioning what you just saw, and loving the film all the more for it. Number 19, White Bird. A very well done historical World War II era movie. It's in the same universe as the 2017 film Wonder, but you don't need to have watched Wonder to understand it. This is a movie that shows that even in dark, uncertain times, there are still people with kindness in their hearts. The friendship between the two main characters, one who's a boy with disabilities and the other a Jewish girl making it into the family shed, is moving and well written. The performances here are quite moving as well. The film is emotional in several ways, and the last 30 minutes are intense, as things go from bad to worse for the main characters. However, amidst the film's intense, serious tone, the film still has an uplifting message of open kindness. I was swelled with emotion during this film. It was so close to making a perfect score. However, the one issue that holds the film back is it seems the writers did not know how to end the film. The last 5 minutes feel shoehorned in and unnecessary, just there to repeat the message that was already well conveyed, and should just let the film speak for itself. And though a character who sets up the film at the beginning is implied to have changed, we never see him go out of his way at the end of the film to repent of the reason he was told the story in the first place. The character is the bully of Augie, the main character of Wonder, who we learn has been expelled for how he treated him. By the end of the film, he has learned kindness, but instead of showing him apologies to Augie, the film instead uses Helen Mirren's character to repeat the film's message. This is a bit of a nitpick, I know, but that's how I feel the film could have wrapped up better. This is a Holocaust film, so it is heavy, so if that's something you're sensitive to, this film may not be for you. But I do think the film has enough of a light in the dark to justify a watch. If you have the time, watch it. At number 18, Monster Summer. It is such a shame that this movie had little to no marketing. It was opening on the same day as Joker 2. It is only showing in one theater in my area when this came out. I live in an area that has 5 different theaters, and only 2 of them were showing this movie. And the big praise I have for this movie is I have no idea why this was rated PG-13. At best, it's a PG. It's the same level as the Jack Black Goosebumps movie or Scooby-Doo. There wasn't anything graphic in terms of the violence, there was no harsh profanity, there was no sexual content or innuendo. It's just a good, clean, fun, entry-level spooky movie for families. Honestly, I've seen PG movies that were much darker than this. And I'm not talking about PG movies like Jaws or Gremlins that were made before PG-13 was created. I'm talking about movies like Coraline and House of the Clock on the Walls that definitely should have been PG-13. The film plays well for both kids and adults, and honestly, I think it does more to adults theaters than it does kids. Kids go missing in this movie, which for a parent is the scariest thing that can happen. Kids will enjoy the kids in this movie teaming up to rid their town of the witch terrorizing it. Yeah, the villain is a witch. I don't know why it's called Monster Summer when the only monster in the movie is a witch. There's no werewolves or vampires. For a smallish budget movie with a fairly limited release, it has a good cast. Mel Gibson, Kevin James, and Smalls from The Sandlot. This is a perfect movie for families for the Halloween season. If you're going to enjoy Goosebumps, Monster House, and things like that, watch it around Halloween time. Now, the movies in my top 10 were in my top 10 for several months, so that should tell you how great they were. Every movie on this list here gets around an A or a B, but it was very hard to make the second part of this list. Number 17, Ultraman Rising. Just for context, I had no idea what Ultraman was going into this. Apparently this is based on an anime from the 60s. That's just to say I have no nostalgia or basis for Ultraman. Even so, I still really enjoyed this movie. I'm a sucker for kaiju movies, so this was right up my alley. The animation is great. It has that Brad Bird style, something you'd see in the Iron Giant or The Incredibles. The action is very reminiscent of Pacific Rim, so I really enjoyed that. The film also has a lot of heart to it with the father-son relationship, and the relationship between the main character and the kaiju he adopts. My only criticism is the villain is a bit underdeveloped. I don't feel the film spent enough time with him to make the audience root against him enough. Other than that, it was excellent. I thought it was a great family movie. Number 16, Sonic 3. The Sonic movies have an interesting history. The first trailer came out and it became the laughingstock of the internet because of ugly Sonic's design, so the studio delays the movie 9 months to fix it. And then the movie comes out right before COVID shuts everything down. Despite the odds being stacked against it, the film still manages to make enough money to justify a sequel. A sequel that led her right into this new one. A movie so anticipated that everybody was harassing the studio to release the trailer. Lots of speculation over who would voice Shadow. Jim Carrey comes out of retirement to play Eggman again. Was the wait worth it? Yes. Yes, it was. I can say this is easily the best of the trilogy. And I'm not someone who knows a ton about Sonic, so I'm not sure how accurate the lore in this movie is, but I will say the way they wrote Shadow as this tragic character was compelling. This is definitely the darkest of the trilogy. There was one scene that had me shocked that they went that dark. I'm not going to spoil it, but if your kids are sensitive, you should look at what content guidance see for kids can handle it. The kids in my audience didn't seem too affected by it. In fact, by the end of the movie, they were standing and clapping, but every kid is different. Now, the tone of the movie can be a bit all over the place at points. On one hand, we have Shadow, who's a dark character with a dark backstory, and then we have Jim Carrey being goofy. Speaking of Jim Carrey, as usual for these films, he's great in it. There was one joke that pulled me out of the movie, though, where they break the fourth wall by acknowledging that he's playing two characters. Now, in Spaceballs or movies like that would fit, but here it's really jarring. There's also a reference to the movie Speed, which stars Keanu Reeves, who voices Shadow in this. The plot, like I said, a bit all over the place. The movie involves a MacGuffin storyline about two keys that are needed to trigger a device, and it takes inspiration from spy movies, and I felt like I'd seen this before. That being said, kids and adults will enjoy it, but more so kids. Inside Out 2. Number 15, Inside Out 2. Since last time Pixar did a movie involving puberty was Turning Red, which I was not very kind on, I was extremely skeptical about this one. I found Turning Red gross and weird. You combine that with my opinion that Pixar hasn't had a good movie since Soul, you can understand why I was nervous. I am pleased to report that Inside Out 2 is a delightful return to form for Pixar. It manages to tackle the topic of puberty in a child-friendly way by simply saying that it's like when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly and leaves it at that. It doesn't go into that birds and the bees discussion, which is what I was worried about. The sequel does what all good sequels do, where it expands on the ideas of the original, and introduces more complex and abstract ideas, such as one's belief system. The new emotions are also very cleverly written and designed, particularly envy, who is the shortest of all the emotions, and embarrassment, who is the largest. Embarrassment doesn't want to be noticed, but he's so big that one can't help but notice him. Then there's envy, who is mad that she's as tall as the other emotions. There's a particularly funny scene where some of the emotions are in a vault of secrets, and one of Riley's secrets is she still likes a show aimed at preschoolers, and the character is very clearly based on Bluey. It was a fun way to levelly poke fun at older kids and adults who watch Bluey. There's a few different animation styles in this film, such as the Bluey parody character, but also a video game character in Riley's mind that's animated like an 8-bit game, and the different styles blend very well. It feels like Pixar is really trying to surpass the standard for animation, which is something I haven't been able to say for a while. It does rehash a few of the ideas from the first film, such as the triple dead gut running joke, and the main message is essentially the same as the first film, that it's okay to feel negative emotions, and you learn to deal with it in a healthy way. The first film, sadness was used as a scapegoat that I had to learn to deal with, and here it's anxiety. This film definitely brings some much-needed fresh life into Pixar. While it's not as good as the first one due to some ideas being reused, I'd still say it's a worthy sequel, and there isn't anything bad in it for kids, so go have a family movie night. Much like Pixar's earlier films, there's something for everyone. Number 14, Godzilla and Kong, The New Empire. Well, this is a major improvement over Godzilla vs. Kong. Now, I still liked Godzilla vs. Kong, but I had my issues with it. Particularly the problem that almost all these movies have, where it focuses too much on the human characters who are not that interesting. The human aspects of this movie are actually a bit more interesting this time, and I actually cared about some of the human characters, specifically the mother and daughter from Godzilla vs. Kong. I was wondering where they were going to go with the plotline of, is she going to stay with the tribe of the forest, or is she going to stay with her mom? They played it so either way would have made sense. As for the monster action, it was fantastic. It was everything I'd wanted in a movie like this. I like how Godzilla was sort of like a pet in this, where he uses the Coliseum as a little pet bed. I thought that was a fun little gag. I thought that was cute. I like how the villain in this movie was this time another monster, instead of a human like it's always been in these other movies where the villain is humanity or the villain is another human. Now this time it's another monster. That was a nice refreshing change. And like I said, the human element isn't very much here. It's more monster focused, which is what we want. This is one of the strongest entries in this monsterverse. Number 13, Mufasa the Lion King. Well, Disney ran out of Shakespeare stories to adapt to be kid-friendly, so let's adapt Moses. If I had a nickel for every Disney CGI talking animal movie that loosely adapted Moses, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice, because Dinosaur was the other one. I was not a fan of the 2019 live-action remake of Lion King. I found it soulless and pointless. So when I heard they were doing another one of those, I groaned. But I was pleasantly surprised by this. For one, the animation is a lot better. The animals actually emote this time. That being said, it looks more like a talking animal movie from the early 2000s like Cats and Dogs. And there are close-up shots of the animals' faces that seem like they were filmed on a GoPro, and they feel pretty jarring, so there is still room for improvement. Or even better, just make it 2D animation, but whatever. The story is pretty great, but like I said, it's basically Moses, albeit very, very loosely. and they're not subtle about it. I mean, Orphan Mufasa is even found in a river by a royal family and acclimated to them. Then they go on a journey to a promised land. It's not subtle. They hit you over the head with that harder than Rafiki hit Simba in the first film. I'm glad that Disney gave us a great villain again. Mads Mikkelsen is great as the villain, and he's just as evil as Scar in the original. The songs are also pretty good. Most of them do sound like Lin-Manuel Miranda's typical stuff, but there is one song that harkens back to the Elton John songs from the original. My only big criticism with this film is the story flow. Timon and Pumbaa are used as a framing device, similar to the grandpa from The Princess Bride, and just like the kid in Princess Bride, they occasionally interrupt the story with questions of banter, and none of those scenes felt necessary. They just felt like they slowed the plot down and were there simply because people like those characters. You could take out every single one of those scenes, and it would be a much better movie. But Mufasa is surprisingly a much epic journey to Pride Rock. Number 12, Dune Part 2. If you saw my review of the first Dune, you know that I wasn't quite sure what to say about it. Initially, it's still the first viewing out the theater feeling kind of empty. I wasn't sure how to feel because I didn't really understand the characters or story, and I found it pretty dense. And part of that was because it was Part 1. So now that I've seen Part 2, I appreciate Part 1 a lot more. Everything about Part 2 drastically improves and builds upon the predecessor. Now that all the world building is out of the way, the film is free to actually get going. It's better paced, and the story is rich and more interesting. The film has beautiful cinematography and a lot of practical effects, which I greatly appreciated. The film's villain, played by Austin Butler, is incredibly sinister. It was one of the best parts of the movie. The fight choreography is fun to watch, and the characters are fleshed out more than they were in Part 1. Now, even though this is Part 2, this isn't Part 2 as in the second half. The film still doesn't wrap everything up. It does end on a cliffhanger right as stuff just gets really exciting. Now, I don't know if that's because the third film is going to be the last third of a book long, or if the next film is going to adapt another book. So if you've read the books of Dune and you know the answer to this, let me know. My other complaint is, I just don't get the appeal of Zendaya. She has no chemistry with Timothée Chalamet, and I can't buy her as the leading love interest. And I can't buy her as the leading love interest. Her performance is drier than the sands of the planet Arrakis. Overall, though, Dune Part 2 is a terrific sci-fi epic, and I highly recommend seeing it. Number 11, Trap. M. Night knows what's hot among white women aged 18 to 30 right now. True crime, serial killer docs, and Taylor Swift. Let's put all those ideas into a movie, and you've got Trap. M. Night has said in the past he's been influenced by Alfred Hitchcock, and going so far as to put himself in his movies as a cameo like Hitchcock would. This definitely feels the most influenced by Hitchcock. As much like Psycho, we follow a serial killer lurk into his psyche. Josh Hartnett is fantastic in the lead role as the serial killer, ranging from creepy to charming when he needs it, and the script is for the most part very smart. At times it feels like the Hitman games, where the main character needs to get certain objects and great distractions to get away, and there's a scene where a character has figured out that the main character is a serial killer. But instead of calling the cops, they instead go live on Instagram, and instead doesn't tell their followers the location. Things like that are a bit annoying. The film is nepotism at its finest, and Shyamalan's daughter plays the Taylor Swift type character. She does a good job, and I was interested to see what happened to her. This is one of Shyamalan's most thrilling original movies, even if at times some of the plot doesn't make sense. And here we go, the top 10 films of 2024. Number 10, Quiet Place Day 1. A Quiet Place is a horror franchise that's managed to remain consistent throughout all three movies. All three of them are very effective and intense, and they are proof that PG-13 horror can be scary. They don't even show that much blood or gore. Quiet Place Day 1 is another worthy entry to the franchise. This time we follow two new characters, and both of them are interesting. And what I really appreciate about these movies is they have disability representation, without making the character with the disability a crutch or a plot device. It ticks me off when horror movies do that, because it feels so tacky and cheap. The first two had a little deaf girl who ends up becoming the hero by the end, and this one is a woman with cancer. Instead of having her be some character who needs to be saved by everybody, they make her independent and interesting. Despite having cancer, she still finds a way to appreciate the simple things in life. Her whole goal in this movie is to get pizza, and she doesn't care that she's surviving against killer aliens. She's gonna get her pizza, darn it. This is also a movie where the characters are actually smart. There weren't any scenes where I was thinking, really? That's one of the stupidest things you could have done. Why'd you make that decision? And these two new characters are great. What makes the movie effective is after the first 15 minutes or so, the whole movie is quiet. So you never know if there's going to be a jump scare, if it's just going to be a scene for character development. So I was constantly on the edge waiting for a jump scare, and sometimes one didn't happen. And when they did happen, they're actually effective and don't feel cheap. I'm very hopeful we get Quiet Place 3, because this franchise keeps knocking it out of the park. The each movie feels more intense than the last. Number 9, Argyle. The closest thing to a Man from U.N.C.L.E. sequel we're going to get for now. You feel like Henry Cavill's a spy, though he's not really the biggest star of the movie, he's more of a supporting character. Now, this is a movie where, thankfully, the trailers did not spoil any of the big twists, and there are a lot of them. Just when you think you have the plot figured out as to where it's going to go, the film throws in some new twists that completely change the film. It also pokes fun at a lot of the spy movie tropes, not being too self-aware about it. And the second half is where the film really kicks into high gear, as all the new information is revealed. The film is really clever when it wants to be. It's a ton of fun, has a great soundtrack, over-the-top action, and snappy dialogue. The film also had an all-star cast, along with great performances from Bryce Dallas Howard, Bryan Cranston, Sam Rockwell, Samuel L. Jackson, and many others. They provide all the right ingredients that make this film entertaining. I had a really great time with this one. If you're looking for a fun spy movie with a lot of twists, this may be what you're looking for. Number 8, Orion in the Dark. Now, DreamWorks definitely peaked with How to Train Your Dragon 3, and it seemed for a while after that they didn't really know what to do. Because for every gem we got, like Puss in Boots and The Last Wish, we also got several duds like Ruby Gilman, Croods 2, Spirit 2. But Orion in the Dark is a fantastic return to form for DreamWorks. A lot of imagination and heart. It feels like an old-school Pixar movie, reminiscent of Inside Out, mixed with a bit of Monsters, Inc. The animation is very new for a DreamWorks movie, and it reminded me a little bit of the animation style for Captain Underpants. The cast of characters are all very charming, and the film does a great job at explaining abstract concepts to kids, without coming off as condescending, or even too complicated. Characters represent things like unexplained noises, quiet, dreams, and insomnia. They're each very uniquely designed, and some of them reminded me a bit of Sesame Street Muppets. The film is very cute and has a great message about conquering fear, and why kids don't need to be afraid of the dark. This is one of the cutest, most charming kids' movies I've seen in a while. DreamWorks really knocked it out of the park with this one. So if you're a parent who's been trying to reassure your child about going to sleep at night, watch this film with them. It has a good lesson, and there wasn't anything in the movie I'd be uncomfortable with kids watching. It's perfect for the 5 to 10-year-old demographic. That's also a film I think everyone could enjoy. Number 7, The Fall Guy. This is some of the most fun I've had in a movie this year. Not only is this movie fantastically directed, with a charismatic, witty cast and script, but it's also got a lot of heart and passion put into it. This feels like a movie made by a director and not by a committee. You can tell the director really has a passion for Hollywood, and especially stuntmen. This is the same director as Fast and Furious, Hobbs and Shaw, which is my personal favorite of the franchise. Now, while it's not as over the top with silliness, the stunts and action are there. There's an actor in this movie who plays a stunt double for Ryan Gosling's character, and I won't spoil who it is, but as soon as they showed this actor, I immediately thought, that's actually perfect casting, because that actor does look a lot like Ryan Gosling, and I can't unsee that now. This has a great mystery with a lot of twists, and a ton of wit and humor, great action, a great love story, and a passion for Hollywood, filmmaking, and stunt people. If you're a cinema buff, it's a must-see. Number 6, Wicked. I have been following the production of this movie ever since it was announced. I think originally it was supposed to come out in 2021, but then they couldn't find the right director, so it just kind of sat in limbo until they announced in 2022 that it was finally coming out in 2024, and it was worth the wait. My sister is actually a huge fan of the musical, and when Oz the Great and Powerful came out, I dressed up to see it as Oz, and she went as Elphaba, or the Wicked Witch. I think she saw the show live at one point when it came here, and she was also in her elementary school's production of The Wiz, where she played a citizen of the Emerald City. And in her formative years about 12 years ago, she would constantly play and sing the songs from Wicked. So I've had some good exposure to this musical, and all that hype was totally worth it. Unlike certain movie musical adaptations where it just looks like a bigger budget version of the musical, this actually looks really cinematic. Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo have a great dynamic with each other, and the actor who plays Fiona really hams it up in the best way. Now, while Ariana Grande does give a good performance, it just feels like she was copying Kristen Chenoweth from the Broadway version. The way she talks, her tone of voice, all feel very reminiscent of Chenoweth, instead of making the character and songs her own. And while Jeff Goldblum gives a good performance as the Wizard, he was clearly only cast based on his namesake, rather than his singing ability. And even his performance as Wizard just feels like every other character he plays. The movie conveys its anti-prejudice message in a way that doesn't feel heavy-handed or preachy, and it doesn't try to make the witch a sympathetic villain. This is part 1 of 2, and if I didn't know that, I'd still be satisfied with where this film ends. It doesn't feel abrupt, it feels earned. This movie is very popular, but let's say for whatever reason it doesn't make enough money for the studio to justify making part 2, I'd still be fine with that, because it doesn't feel like there's anything that needs to be continued. Whether you're a fan of the musical or not, Wicked soars high. Number 5, Spellbound. Disney really needs to look at this film and take notes, because with them giving us practically nothing but sequels and remakes, this is a film in the animation sphere that stands out. And what else can you expect from John Lasseter, the director of Shrek, and songwriter Alan Menken? This is an imaginative, creative, and inspired fairy tale. It feels like a throwback to the Disney Renaissance era, while also not feeling derivative. The songs by Alan Menken are some of the best songs I've heard in an animated film in years, and I like how this breaks the typical animated fairy tale movie formula. The main character, instead of having dead parents, instead has parents who have been cursed to be monsters, and the quest is to turn them back. The whole cast is great, but especially Nathan Lane and John Lithgow as comic relief characters. The film doesn't have a villain, but it doesn't really need one. The conflict is more between the main character trying to get her parents to put aside their differences. The family message in Quest did remind me a bit of Pixar's Brave and Onward, but this film did it much better than either of those films. Spellbound is a refreshing animated film, and I hope gets some love for both the story and songs at the 2025 Oscars. Number 4, Moana 2. So for those who don't know, this originally started out as a series for Disney+, but after wishing to perform, Disney decided to rework this as a film. Initially, this worried me. I worried that the plot would feel episodic, similar to the Clone Wars movie, which was just 4 episodes of the show edited together. With Clone Wars, you can tell where the episodes ended and the next one began. However, that is not the case with this film. The plot flowed pretty naturally. I really enjoyed how this film expands mythology. Moana and her little sister were a great dynamic, reminding me of Nani and Lilo from Lilo and Stitch. And we finally, after 11 years, have a great Disney villain. And on top of that, a great villain song. I don't consider Shiny from the first Moana to be a villain song per se, because Tamatoa wasn't an overarching threat. He was in the movie for like 5 minutes, and that was it. The villain in this movie is an overarching threat, and she has a great villain song that feels like a mixture of I Won't Say I'm a Love from Hercules and Yzma's deleted villain song from a Persian group back when that was called King of the Sun. And she's a pretty scary, threatening villain. She reminded me of the villain for DreamWorks' Sinbad. Now, Lin-Manuel Miranda didn't do the songs this time around, and you can kind of tell. None of the songs are awful, but they're not as good as the songs from the first film. They're still pretty catchy, though, but they do feel like a cheaper version of Lin's work. But there weren't any where I thought, oh, this is such a bad song, can we please move on? I thought they were pretty good. And I think making this a movie instead of a show was a great decision, because the scale of this movie is huge. There's a scene with the whale that filled up the whole screen. There's monsters in this movie that feel very cinematic. And the scale is not something that would be as effective if this were just a streaming series. Now, on a plot level, I didn't think it was as strong as the first film. Moana didn't really have that interesting of a character arc. Side characters in the film are all pretty forgettable, and the humor in the movie isn't as clever. The jokes in this movie are either repeats of jokes in the first film, or they simply don't make sense. The boat stack joke is repeated a few times. The joke about how Moana isn't a princess is repeated. The joke about the chicken screaming all the time is repeated. And there's a joke about butt dialing from Maui, which he says will make more sense in about 2,000 years, which doesn't make sense. Like, does Maui have omniscience? The joke about tweeting from the first movie was mildly amusing, but yeah, it doesn't make sense to have modern references in this movie. So while it isn't as strong as the first film, it's still pretty solid and is worth returning to the world of Moana. Number 3, The Wild Robot. Sorry, Pixar, this is going to beat Inside Out 2 at the Oscars this year. And if it doesn't, I seriously don't know what's wrong with the Academy. This movie is beautifully animated. I continue to be impressed by DreamWorks experimenting with new animation styles, whether that be the storybook-like animation of Puss in Boots' Last Wish, or the new character designs for Orion in the Dark. I was worried based on the second trailer that this would be another DreamWorks talking animal movie, indistinguishable from likes of Madagascar, Kung Fu Panda, Bee-Movie, Over the Hedge, but the reason for the animals talking does make more sense in the context of the film, and it doesn't feel forced or cheap. The main character is the most emotional robot I've seen in a film since Iron Giant. There's a fair bit of dark humor, particularly from 3 rather morose possum babies, whose hyperfixation with the circle of life is reminiscent of the star from the Mario movie last year. The film has a fantastic score, which is a shame why there's a generic pop song halfway through the movie, and it sounds very similar to what used in Pixar's Brave. Had the film just used score instead, I would have enjoyed those scenes a bit more. The first act does move a bit too fast, putting its second act emotional punch at the end of the first act. However, halfway through the second act, the film manages to find its footing again, and brings back all the emotional punch and poignancy. It feels like the good old days of Pixar when they made films where the kids could enjoy the bright colors and cute characters, but the adults got more out of it through the emotional message. Wild Robot will become an instant classic. Our runner-up at number 2 is The Best Christmas Pageant Ever. Now, I grew up loving this book. Our teacher read it to us in 3rd grade, and I fell in love with it. It's been a long time since I've seen a Christmas movie that was actually religious. Now, there's nothing wrong with secular Christmas movies. A lot of my favorites fall into that category. But it's nice to have a movie that takes a break from Santa and focuses on the religious reason for Christmas. And what a delight this movie is. It's very reminiscent of the film A Christmas Story with the way it's structured. The main character is an adult narrating the film with little cutaway gags. The film is very sweet and heartwarming, and has some pretty powerful moments. The whole cast is a delight, and they don't miss a beat with the comedic timing and the powerful dramatic moments. Religious films tend to have a negative reception, even among the target audience of Christians, because they are so stereotypically heavy-handed it can be overacted. I'm LDS, and though we have made a fair share of some pretty entertaining films, we've also made some that are a bit hokey. Regardless of your Christian denomination, you can enjoy this movie. This is going to be a Christmas classic for decades to come. If you celebrate Christmas, it's a must-see. And the number one film of 2024 is Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. While this one didn't have as much heart as the previous three films, particularly Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, it still expanded the world in compelling ways. The villain is one of the best in this franchise, and the new main character, while he's not as interesting as Caesar, still is well done. And the visual effects for this movie are perfect, and set a new standard for film. This, along with Dune Part 2, are very likely going to be nominated for Best Visual Effects at the Oscars next year. You can tell this was directed by the same director as the Maze Runner films, particularly in the third act, because there are a lot of reminders of that style. And I think it worked. It had a compelling mystery, great action, an interesting world, the testing the effects. It made me go bananas, and I can't wait for the next entry in the franchise. So there you go. There's my ranking of every 2024 release that I saw. Be sure to share your ranking in the comments.